Welcome to Lessons and Stories. This is the channel where every story carries a lesson. Today we're heading to Yekaterinburg, Russia, a city that sits right on the border between Europe and Asia, which is exactly the kind of geographical identity crisis that Russians find deeply romantic and tourists find deeply confusing. We're going to follow Daria, 41 years old, a cardiologist who spent a decade keeping other people's hearts alive without noticing that her own was being slowly hollowed out. What her husband Bogdan didn't know is that on the morning he chose to finalize her destruction, a stranger on a bus stop bench had already decided to save her. Stick around until the end, because this story is packed with lessons. But before we start, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, and drop a comment telling us what city or state you're watching from. It means everything to us knowing where you all are watching from. All right. Let's get into the story. The alarm went off at 5:45 in the morning, the way it always did. Daria was already half awake before it rang, the kind of sleep that doesn't quite take, where you spend the night cycling through the same three thoughts without ever finishing any of them. She silenced the alarm, sat up in the dark, and listened. Bogdan was breathing steadily beside her, his back turned, the way it had been turned for how long now? 2 years? 3? She had stopped counting. She got up without making a sound. That was something she'd learned without anyone teaching her, how to exist quietly inside her own home. In Russia, cardiology shifts start before the city does. The head of department, a woman Daria privately referred to as the general, and I want to be very clear that this was not a term of affection, had zero tolerance for late arrivals. Zero. Daria had watched that zero applied to other doctors, and had no interest in experiencing it firsthand. So, when she moved through that apartment, she moved like someone who knew exactly how much margin she had, which was none. She dressed in the hallway. She made herself a cup of tea she didn't have time to drink. She packed her bag, stethoscope, documents, 2 bottles of medication she was keeping for a patient who couldn't afford the pharmacy price, and she was out the door before 6:15. The morning air hit her like cold water. Yekaterinburg in late autumn doesn't ease you into the day. It grabs you by the collar. She walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop with her coat pulled tight, going over the previous night's conversation in her head. Not a conversation, really. More like a script she'd been handed without being asked. Bogdan had come home after midnight. She'd been awake, reading, waiting in the way that people wait when they already know something is wrong and are just waiting for the right words to confirm it. He smelled like expensive cologne, not his, and something darker underneath. He said he'd been at a work dinner. She said nothing. He kissed her on the forehead with all the warmth of someone kissing an envelope and disappeared into the bathroom. 10 years of marriage. This was what 10 years looked like. The bus stop was already crowded when she arrived. And here is where we need to talk about the marshrutka. Because if you're American and you've never encountered one, you're in for an education. A marshrutka is a shared minibus, usually a battered Soviet-era vehicle that runs a fixed route through the city, picks up passengers wherever it feels like, and operates on a social contract that is entirely informal and somehow functions perfectly. You flag it down, you get on, you pass your money forward through a chain of strangers to the driver up front, and your change comes back the same way. Nobody questions this system. Nobody loses money. It just works the way a lot of things in Russia work, through a kind of collective trust that looks chaotic from the outside and is actually iron-tight on the inside. Back in the States, you might compare it to a dollar van in New York or a shared shuttle in a mid-sized city, but that doesn't quite capture it. Those have a schedule. A marshrutka has a philosophy. Daria's marshrutka arrived 4 minutes late and packed like a tin of sardines that had been through something traumatic. She squeezed herself into the back row between a man in a fur hat and a woman with a shopping trolley, pressed her bag against her chest and held on. The ride was 20 minutes. She spent all 20 of them inside her own head. 3 years. That's what she kept coming back to. 3 years ago, when they were renovating the apartment together, choosing tiles for the kitchen, arguing gently about the color of the bedroom walls, laughing when the contractor showed up 3 days late with the wrong flooring, Bogdan had still looked at her like she was someone worth looking at, or maybe she had just wanted to believe that. Maybe she had been telling herself a story about her own life for so long that she'd forgotten to check whether it was still true. Her stop came up. She stood, grabbed her bag, and pushed toward the door. The marshrutka lurched, the door banged open, and Daria stepped out onto the sidewalk. The vehicle grumbled away. She straightened her coat, reached into her bag for her phone to text Bogdan, "Good morning," a habit she kept out of stubbornness more than affection at this point, and her hand found nothing. She looked down. The bag was open at the top. The lining was visible. The familiar weight of the stethoscope, the rustle of documents, the solid square of her wallet gone. All of it gone. She turned around. The marshrutka was already rounding the corner, taillights disappearing into the gray morning. She stood very still on the empty sidewalk and ran a mental inventory of everything inside that bag. Documents, keys to the apartment, her work badge, the medication she was carrying for her patient, 240 rubles she'd been meaning to deposit, the stethoscope her father had given her the day she graduated, the stethoscope her father had given her. She pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed, and then she heard someone say, quietly but clearly, "Child." She turned. On the bench, at the edge of the bus stop, a bench she had walked past 100 times without noticing, sat an old woman. Old in the way that some people are old, where you can't really tell whether they're 70 or 90, because time has done something unusual with their face. She was wearing a long coat that had been out of fashion for at least 4 decades, and a headscarf with faded roses that was tied under her chin. In her hands, she was holding Daria's bag. The bag with the worn leather side and the small heart-shaped keychain that Daria had bought at an airport kiosk 2 years ago, on a layover she'd taken alone because Bogdan had canceled at the last minute. Daria walked toward her in 3 steps that felt like they took a full minute each. If she had known, in that moment, exactly what the next 24 hours were going to require of her, the storage room, the crouching, the cardboard box corner, the notary's office, the particular look on a man's face when his entire plan collapses in front of a stranger in reading glasses, she might have sat back down on that bench and called in sick for the whole week. But she didn't know, so she walked forward instead, which is how most of the important things in a life get started. "That's my bag," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. Where did you find it?" The woman looked up at her. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the eyes that met Daria's were not old eyes. They were sharp and clear and attentive in a way that made Daria feel, for just a second, like she was the one being read, not the other way around. The woman held the bag out. "Take it, child." Daria reached for it. When their fingers touched, she felt, and she would try to describe this later and never quite manage it, a coldness that didn't belong to the morning. The woman's hand was ice, despite the fact that she was sitting in full sunlight. "Thank you," Daria said, pulling the bag to her chest. "I don't know how to thank you. I have everything in here. Sit down a moment," the woman said. Daria checked the time on her watch. 6:37. She had 9 minutes before she absolutely had to be moving. "I can't," she said. "I'm late for—" "Sit." There was nothing loud about it, nothing threatening, and yet Daria sat. "Look, I've heard a lot of stories on this channel, and one thing I've learned is that there are moments in a person's life where something in the room shifts, where the air gets heavier or lighter, or different in a way you can't name, and your body knows it before your brain does." Daria's brain was saying, "Get up, you're already late. This woman is a stranger." But Daria's body sat. The woman spoke. She said, "You're going to miss your shift today." Not as a question. Daria started to object. "You're going to take the number 7 marshrutka toward the center. There's a building on Stroitly Avenue, glass front. Blue sign, 4 floors. Construction company. Your husband's office is on the 4th floor." Daria went very still. "At the end of the corridor on the 4th floor," the woman continued, in the same quiet, unhurried voice, "there is a storage room, cleaning supplies, shelves of paper. You're going to go in there, close the door, and wait. Don't make a sound. Don't leave until you've heard what you need to hear." She paused. "Today you can change everything, or you can lose everything. But if you walk into that hospital this morning, you will regret it." Daria stared at her. The rational part of her brain, the cardiologist's brain, The part trained to assess situations clearly and quickly was generating several explanations simultaneously. Scam. Delusional elderly woman. Elaborate social experiment. Mistaken identity. All of them reasonable. All of them landing about 3 feet short of the feeling in her chest. "How do you know about my husband?" she said. The woman tilted her head slightly. "You're Daria, wife of Bogdan Petrov. Cardiologist, not a nurse, don't let anyone call you otherwise. You want children and haven't been able to have them, and you carry that quietly because you don't want to seem like you're asking for sympathy." She looked at Daria steadily. "You're afraid your husband has stopped loving you, and you are correct. But fear is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is what you need today." The silence that followed was the loudest Daria had heard in years. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman stood up from the bench. For someone who'd appeared frail sitting down, she moved with a certain deliberate economy that was more unsettling than any urgency would have been. "Don't ask that," she said. "There isn't time. Do what I've told you." And she walked into the morning crowd slowly, without hurrying, without looking back, and simply was no longer visible. Daria sat on the bench alone with her bag in her lap. The rational brain was still talking. It was saying, "This is absurd. This is paranoid. This woman doesn't know anything. Get up and go to work." It was making excellent points. Every single one of them bounced off the surface of what had just happened and fell to the ground. Because here is what the rational brain could not explain. How that woman knew her name. How she knew about Bogdan. How she had used the exact words "stopped loving you" that Daria had been keeping locked in a drawer inside herself for 3 years, refusing to say aloud even in her own head, because saying them out loud meant they were real. She sat on that bench for 90 more seconds. Then she took out her phone and typed a message to the department head. "Family situation. Running late. Apologies." She pressed send before she could talk herself out of it and dropped the phone into her bag. The general's reply came in 40 seconds flat. 40 seconds. The woman did not sleep, she simply dimmed. The message read, "This is unacceptable. We will discuss." 3 words of actual content and 1 declaration of future consequences. Pure military grammar. Daria turned the phone face down in her bag and stood up. The number 7 Marshrutka was already pulling in. She got on. The ride to the center took 12 minutes. She sat near the window and watched the city slide past the gray blocks of Soviet-era apartment buildings giving way to newer glass towers, the streets filling with the morning's commuters, the bakeries opening their doors with clouds of steam rolling out onto the sidewalk. A normal Tuesday in Yekaterinburg. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Except her. Here's something most people in the States wouldn't know about Russian cities. The Soviet apartment block, what they call a Khrushchevka, was built in the 1950s and 60s as a temporary solution to a post-war housing shortage. Temporary. That was the plan. Most of them are still standing. Daria had grown up in one. She and Bogdan had bought a newer place, but her mother still lived in one, on the 7th floor of a building that had been temporary for 60 years. There's something in that, in the way temporary things outlast all expectations, that Daria would think about later. She got off 2 stops before the address and walked the rest of the way. The building was exactly where the woman had said it would be. Glass and steel. 4 floors. Blue sign over the entrance. Stroy Capital, a construction company. Bogdan's employer for the past 6 years. She had been to his office exactly twice. Once for a company New Year's party, where she'd stood next to him and smiled for photographs. And once when she'd dropped off a forgotten document and he'd met her in the lobby and taken it from her hands without inviting her upstairs. At the time, she had thought nothing of it. She thought about it now. There was security at the entrance, a turnstile, a guard behind a desk, a badge reader on the wall. She stopped on the sidewalk and considered this. And then, because the universe apparently had decided to commit to this particular Tuesday, a group of employees came out through a side door, smokers returning from a break, laughing about something. Badges clipped to their lapels and left the door swinging. Daria caught it before it closed. She walked through like she belonged there. Shoulders back, eyes forward. The posture of someone who is exactly where they're supposed to be and knows it. Pay attention to what Daria did and did not do. She did not look for exits. She did not scan for cameras. She was not performing confidence for an audience. She was simply a woman who had been through enough that morning to have burned through her fear and come out the other side into a kind of cold, clear purpose. When you operate from that place, people do not look twice at you. Not because you have fooled them, but because calm is its own kind of armor. Elevator to the 4th floor. The doors opened onto a long corridor with fluorescent lighting and the particular flat smell of a busy office coffee, paper, stale air conditioning. She read the plaques on the doors as she walked: accounting, human resources, sales, director's office, standard architecture of corporate life. She walked slowly, like she was looking for someone, which, technically, she was. At the far end of the corridor, next to the fire exit, there was a door with no placard, just a door, smaller than the others. She tried the handle. It gave. Inside, shelving units, mop buckets, boxes of printer paper stacked to the ceiling, a smell of cleaning fluid and old dust, a narrow strip of floor, and in the far corner, behind a stack of boxes, a space just barely large enough for a person. Daria pulled the door almost shut behind her, leaving a gap no wider than a finger, just enough to let in a thread of hallway light and let out sound. She pressed herself into the corner behind the boxes, crouched down, and waited. For those who don't know, in Russia, a storeroom like this one would be called a chulin, from a word that just means a dark, enclosed space for keeping things that don't have anywhere else to go. There's a whole category of Russian domestic architecture dedicated to these small, invisible rooms. Every apartment building has them. Every office corridor has one. Places where things are put away and not thought about. Daria, crouching in the dark with her heart beating in her ears, thought that was exactly the kind of detail that would be funny later. Later, when she could breathe. The first hour passed in fragments. Footsteps outside. A phone call about a supplier dispute. 2 men arguing in the far office about a deadline. A woman laughing at something on her computer. The regular percussion of an ordinary working day. Daria's legs went numb from crouching. Her back found the sharp corner of a cardboard box and made friends with it, whether she wanted that friendship or not. The cold of the concrete floor crept up through her shoes. She thought about leaving. She composed the thought carefully. I am a grown woman crouching in a stranger's storage room based on the instructions of an old woman at a bus stop. I have medical training. I am going to stand up and go to work. She stayed. And then, after an hour and 11 minutes by her watch, she heard footsteps coming down the corridor. 2 sets. Moving with the kind of purpose that's different from office traffic, not the shuffle of someone heading to the printer, but the stride of people going somewhere specific and not wanting to be seen going there. They stopped outside the storage room door. In here, said a man's voice. Low, certain. Nobody comes down this end. Daria's whole body went cold from the inside out. She knew that voice. She had fallen asleep to that voice for 10 years. She had heard it say, good morning and good night, and you worry too much, and I love you back when it still said I love you. She had heard it angry and tired, and occasionally tender, in the early years when tender was still something he offered. It was Bogdan. She pressed her back against the wall and stopped breathing. The door swung open. Light poured in. She pulled herself further behind the stack of boxes, making herself as small as possible, watching through the narrow gap she'd left in the door. Bogdan entered first. Behind him, a young woman, late 20s, blonde, wearing a fitted dress that announced its own presence before the rest of her did. Daria recognized her. Her name was Elena. She worked as an assistant to the company's general director. She had come to their apartment twice with documents. Both times Bogdan had answered the door before Daria could get there. Elena wrinkled her nose. It smells in here. It's fine, Bogdan said, in the tone of someone who has already decided this conversation is over. We needed somewhere quiet. Couldn't we have used your car? The parking lot has cameras, he said it simply, like this was information he had thought about at some length. Here we're alone. And there it is, right there, in that sentence, the thing that tells you everything about a person. Not the betrayal, not the lies, not even what came next. The parking lot has cameras. A man who thinks like that, who maps his exits before he enters a room, is not a man who stumbled into something. He is a man who has been planning. Daria stayed perfectly still, Bogdan turned to face Elena. He was wearing the dark suit she'd hung in the closet 3 days ago after picking it up from the dry cleaner. That suit, she had paid for that dry cleaning with her own money. "Is everything ready?" he asked. Elena nodded. She had moved closer to him, not touching, but close, with the practiced ease of two people who had been close many times before. "The notary is confirmed for tomorrow. 3 in the afternoon. My contact, he's solid. He's done this before. The power of attorney looks exactly right. And the signature? It's clean. If you put it side by side with the original, you might spot something. But the notary won't be looking that hard. Not when she's already on our side." Bogdan nodded slowly. He put his hand on her shoulder, not affectionately, more like a man checking that an object is still where he left it. "The apartment goes to you first. We sell within 6 months. Split the proceeds. The credit lines are all in her name, so those stay with her. By the time she figures out anything is wrong, it'll already be done." Elena tilted her head. "And if she questions it?" "She won't." The certainty in his voice was the particular certainty of someone who has made a thorough study of another person's weaknesses. "She trusts me completely. Always has. She thinks the long hours are work. She thinks the distance is stress. She thinks we're fine." He said the last word, with a flatness that was worse than contempt. "She wants to believe it, so she does." Women always believe what they want to believe. There are moments when language stops working. When the words you're hearing are in a language you know, composed of vocabulary you understand, and they still don't reach you because the brain refuses to complete the transaction. Daria had read about this phenomenon, psychological dissociation, as a protective response to overwhelming information. She had explained it to patients' families. She understood it academically. She understood it personally now. She sat in the dark behind the printer paper boxes and felt the words land, one at a time, like stones dropped into still water. The apartment, the signature, her name on the credit lines. 3 years. He had been calculating this for 3 years. The renovation, the tiles, the bedroom walls, the flooring had not been a shared project. It had been an investment, his investment, in something he was planning to take. "And she won't suspect?" Elena asked again. She had the particular anxiety of someone who understands they're the weaker party in a conspiracy. "I've told her I'm saving for the future, for children." A pause. "She believes that too." Something in his voice shifted, not softening, but something more like contempt, with a thin layer of amusement over it. 10 years, Lena. I've been watching that woman carry this marriage like it was made of glass, terrified of dropping it. She gives everything. Works nights, brings me food, asks nothing. It's almost—" He stopped himself. "Almost what?" Elena asked. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Don't be late." Elena said something else, something lower that Daria couldn't quite catch. Then Bogdan's voice again, clipped. "We should go back separately, 5 minutes apart." The door opened. Light flashed in. Daria pushed herself further into the corner, not breathing, not moving. A shadow crossed the gap. The door swung shut. Silence. She sat in the dark for a long time. Her stethoscope was in her bag. She could feel the outline of it through the leather. The one her father had given her at graduation, 15 years ago, the year he'd held her face in both hands, and said, "Now go listen to the world, Dashenka." She pressed her hand against the outside of the bag, over the spot where it rested, and concentrated on that. There's a thing that happens when you know something you cannot unknow. You don't immediately spring into action. You don't cry, necessarily, or rage. You sit with it first. You let it settle. And what she felt sitting in that chulin with the smell of cleaning fluid and old paper, with the sound of the office going about its entirely ordinary Tuesday outside the door, was not grief, not yet. And not anger, not yet either. What she felt was a strange, cold, clarifying calm. She had all the information she needed. She had until tomorrow at 3 o'clock, and for the first time in 10 years, she was not going to be caught without a plan. She waited another 20 minutes after the footsteps disappeared, not because she was afraid of being seen, though she was, but because her legs had gone completely numb from the crouch, and she was fairly certain that if she stood up too fast, she would pitch forward into a shelf of cleaning. supplies, and announce herself to the entire fourth floor. So she waited. She let the blood come back to her feet. She listened to the ordinary sounds of the corridor. Someone printing something. A phone call about a delivery schedule. The distant ping of the elevator. When she finally unfolded herself and stood, the stiffness in her back was so sharp she had to press her fist against her spine and breathe through it. She checked the gap in the door. Empty corridor, fluorescent light, the fire exit sign at the far end glowing its permanent red. She eased the door open, stepped out, pulled it shut behind her without making a sound. She walked to the staircase. Not the elevator. Elevators have doors that open at random floors, and descended all 4 flights at a pace that was exactly 1 notch slower than the pace of someone who desperately wants to run. Out through the lobby, past the front desk without making eye contact, through the glass doors and onto the street. The cold air landed on her face like a hand. She stood on the sidewalk of Stroitley Avenue and looked at her phone. 8:47 in the morning. The street was fully awake now. Buses, pedestrians, a woman selling flowers from a cart on the corner, a delivery truck double-parked with its hazards blinking. The absolute, indifferent normalcy of the world going about its business while hers had just been disassembled in a storage closet. She had 17 hours and 15 minutes until 3 o'clock tomorrow. She started walking. Now this is the part of the story where a lot of women would call their sister, or their mother, or their best friend, and spend the next 4 hours on the phone processing everything they'd just heard. And listen, there's nothing wrong with that. There is genuine wisdom in talking it through. But Daria was a cardiologist. She spent her professional life making decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, when the cost of the wrong move was someone's life. She did not process by talking. She processed by thinking, and she was very, very good at thinking. She walked for 11 blocks before she stopped at a small cafe, ordered a tea she actually had time to drink this time, sat down at a corner table, and opened her phone's notes application. She wrote 4 words, "What do I know?" And then she wrote everything. Not the emotional version, not the part about his hand on Elena's shoulder, not the particular flatness in his voice when he said she wants to believe it, but the operational version, the facts, the timeline, the parties involved, the mechanics of what was being planned. Power of attorney, forged signature, notary, with a prearranged outcome, sale of apartment, proceeds divided, credit lines remaining in her name. She looked at what she'd written. Then she added a 5th word. What can I prove? Underneath it she wrote, I was there. I heard everything. That is not nothing. She sat with her tea and thought about Egor Vasiliev. For those of you who don't know the name, Igor Vasiliev was a man Daria had known since she was 12 years old. When they had sat next to each other in the back row of a mathematics class, they both found entirely pointless. He had grown up to be a family law attorney, the kind who handled divorces, property disputes, and occasionally the uglier varieties of financial betrayal. She had not seen him in 3 years. The last time had been at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, where he had given her his card and said, in the particular way of someone who is leaving a door open without explaining why, "If you ever need anything, Dasha, call me. Anything at all." She had put the card in the back of a drawer. She remembered exactly which drawer. She called him. He answered on the 3rd ring with the confident bass of someone who had been expecting calls at odd hours for 20 years. She gave him her name. She heard the brief recalibration in his voice, surprise, then sharpening attention, then something that might have been the professional instinct recognizing the shape of what was coming before she'd said a word. "I need to meet today," she said. "It's urgent, and Igor, it's bad." A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "I have a cancellation at noon. The cafe across from my office. You know, the one with the green awning near the old market. I'll be there." She put the phone down and finished her tea. Here is something worth knowing about family law in Russia, for anyone unfamiliar with how this works. Property acquired during a marriage in Russia is considered joint marital property by law. It must be divided equally in a divorce, in theory. But here's where it gets complicated. If one spouse transfers property out of both names before the divorce is filed, using forged documents and a notary who has agreed to look the other way, the injured party can end up with nothing, and proving the fraud after the fact is extraordinarily difficult. In the United States, we'd call this fraudulent conveyance, and it carries serious criminal exposure. In Russia, the criminal statute exists too. The difference is that enforcing it requires evidence, and evidence requires someone who was paying attention. Daria had been paying attention. She spent the time until noon going back to the apartment. Bogdan would be at the office, she had no reason to think otherwise, running his ordinary fraudulent Tuesday. The apartment was empty. She moved through it quickly and without sentiment, which turned out to be easier than she expected. When you understand that a space was never really yours, that it was always, in someone else's calculation, an asset to be liquidated, it stops feeling like home. She found the safe in the bedroom closet, Bogdan's safe, which he considered private, and which she had known the combination to for 6 years, having watched him set it up on an evening when he forgot she was standing behind him. She had never mentioned this. Some truths you leave in the drawer until you're ready. She was ready now. She opened it. Inside, the apartment deeds, the original purchase documents, a folder of credit agreements, the ones that were, as Bogdan had told Elena, all in her name, which she now understood was not an accident but a construction. A small stack of handwritten notes she didn't recognize at first glance. Bank statements that she photographed quickly without reading, knowing she could read them later. And at the very bottom, a paper she had to look at twice before she understood what she was seeing. A draft agreement for the sale of the apartment, with a price and a buyer's name already filled in. Dated 6 weeks ago. He had been 6 weeks ahead of her. She photographed everything, closed the safe, left the apartment with the same quiet she had entered it. The meeting with Igor lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. She told him everything. She told him in the same order she had written it in the cafe facts first, emotional content later, because she did not have the luxury of leading with the emotional content, and she knew it. Igor listened with his elbows on the table, and his hands folded, and his eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder, the way she had seen good doctors listen, the way that means, I am taking all of this in, I am not interrupting because I need to hear the whole shape of it before I respond. When she finished, he unfolded his hands. How much of this can you corroborate? He asked. I have photographs of everything in the safe. I have the original credit agreements. I have the draft sale document with the buyer's name. The conversation you overheard, is there anything? No recording. She had thought about this. She had been sitting in the dark with her phone in her bag. She had not thought to record. This was the one gap. Just my testimony. Egor nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. It's enough, he said. Particularly the draft agreement. That's premeditation. That's 6 weeks of documented intent. He looked at her directly. The forged power of attorney, once you appear in person at the notary's office and declare it fraudulent, the transaction cannot proceed, and once it can't proceed, he's exposed. The notary is on the hook. The scheme unravels publicly. He paused. You understand what I'm saying? You have to be there. Tomorrow. Before they sign anything. I know, Daria said. And Dasha. He leaned forward slightly. You have to stay calm. No shouting. No accusations you can't prove in that room. You walk in. You identify yourself. You make one clear statement. The document is forged. You never signed it. You're prepared to prove it. That's all. Let them fall apart on their own. She looked at him across the table. She thought, I have known this man for 29 years, and I never once called him when I needed help. Women like her, the quiet ones, the capable ones, the ones who carry things without asking, spend years believing that needing help is a form of failure. She filed that thought away for later, too. Tell me exactly what to do, she said. He told her. That evening, Bogdan came home at 11. She heard the key in the lock, the familiar sequence of his entrance coat on the hook, shoes at the door, kitchen for water, then the bathroom. She lay in bed with her eyes open and her breathing steady and her mind arranged into a kind of focused stillness she usually reserved for difficult procedures. He came to bed. He lay down with his back to her, as always. Within 4 minutes, he was asleep. She looked at the ceiling. In the morning, she was up at 5:30. She made coffee. She made his sandwiches. She set them on the counter with the particular care of someone performing an action for the last time without letting on that they know it's the last time. When Bogdan came into the kitchen, yawning, He looked at her and said, "You look pale." "I didn't sleep well," she said. "Headache," he grunted. He picked up his coffee and looked at his phone. On the screen, briefly visible before he angled it away, she saw a message with a small heart icon beside the sender's name. She recognized the icon. She had looked at Elena's contact in his phone once, months ago, late at night when he'd left it on the kitchen counter and gone to shower, and had put it back down and told herself it meant nothing. She refilled his coffee without being asked. He left at 7:50. He did not kiss her goodbye. He hadn't done that in 2 years, but he paused at the door and said, in a tone that she now understood, was the tone of someone performing normalcy for an audience of one. "Don't wait up tonight. Big project." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Take care of yourself." He closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for 60 seconds, listening to his footsteps fade down the stairwell. Then she picked up her phone and sent Igor a single message. "I'm ready. See you there." At 2:15 in the afternoon, Daria was standing across the street from the notary's office. It was a nondescript building in a quieter part of the city, no sign that would catch a stranger's eye, no visible street number, the kind of place you would only find if someone had already told you where it was. Which told her something. Legitimate transactions don't require invisible locations. She was wearing a dark coat and a headscarf she had borrowed from the back of her closet, the kind of headscarf that was common enough in the city to be invisible. Dark glasses. She looked, she thought, like half the women over 50 on any street in Yekaterinburg. She looked, specifically, like no one in particular. Here is something worth knowing about notaries in Russia, because they are nothing like what an American would expect. In the United States, a notary public is someone at your bank or your local shipping store who watches you sign something and stamps it. The bar for becoming one is low. The authority is limited. In Russia, a notary is a highly trained legal officer with the authority of the state, closer to what we'd call a judge for private transactions. A Russian notary can authenticate documents, certify inheritances, register property transactions, and their seal has the force of law, which is exactly why a corrupt notary is such an effective tool. If the notary certifies it, it is on paper real. The entire scheme depended on a notary who had been persuaded to look away. And Daria was about to make that notary look directly. She crossed the street at 2:28 and entered the building. The interior was dim and smelled of old paper, the particular smell, she noted with a distant part of her mind, of a place where consequential things happened and were then filed away and never spoken of again. A narrow staircase. Second floor. A corridor with 3 doors. The third door had a placard. Notary Semyonova, Tatiana Pavlovna. She sat down on the bench outside it, pulled her scarf slightly lower, and waited. She heard them before she saw them. The footsteps came up the staircase at 2:56, 4 minutes early, which told her that Bogdan was nervous. Bogdan was never early. He was a man who arrived at exactly the right moment, not before, because arriving early conceded something. Nervousness will do that to a plan. They came down the corridor without looking toward her. Bogdan in a dark suit, not the one she had dry cleaned, a different one with his briefcase and the particular set of his shoulders that she recognized as his performing competence face. Elena in a red dress that was doing considerable work to be noticed. They walked past the bench. They did not glance at the figure sitting quietly in a headscarf and dark glasses. They went through the door. Pay attention to this moment. Because there is a thing that happens when a person believes they are invisible. When they've planned everything, when they've drawn the map and confirmed the route and arranged all the pieces, they stop looking. They have already, in their mind, arrived. And that is precisely when the ground shifts. Daria counted to 5 minutes on her watch. Then she stood, removed her dark glasses and her headscarf, tucked them into her coat pocket, and knocked. "Come in," said a woman's voice. She opened the door and stepped into the room. It was a small office. Modestly furnished a desk with organized stacks of documents, 2 client chairs, a small window that let in a narrow rectangle of afternoon light. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled back tightly, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The notary, Tatiana Pavlovna Semyonova. She had the face of someone who had seen a great deal of human behavior in this room and had long since stopped being surprised by most of it. In the 2 client chairs, with their backs to the door, sat Bogdan and Elena. Bogdan turned at the sound of the door. And here is the moment, the one that the whole story has been building toward. Watch it carefully. His face went through 5 distinct stages in approximately 2 seconds. First, polite inquiry. Who is this person? Are they in the right room? Second, recognition, the shape of her, the familiar curve of her jaw, the way she held herself. Third, a freezing, a pure physical stopping, as if someone had reached into the mechanism of him and removed a crucial gear. Fourth, a reaching for the explanation, the excuse, the reframing. You can see it in the eyes, the rapid calculation. And fifth, the understanding that there was no reframing available. His mouth opened. His briefcase, which had been balanced on his knee, began to slide. He caught it, barely. Elena turned a half-second after Bogdan. She had been looking at a document on the desk. She turned, and all the carefully applied color in her face simply left. She went the particular shade of white that makes expensive foundation look theatrical. Daria looked at them both for exactly 1 second. Then she turned to the notary. "My name is Daria Petrova," she said. Her voice was level, clear. She had rehearsed this sentence approximately 40 times in the past 18 hours, and it came out exactly as she intended. "I am the registered co-owner of the apartment at Lenina Street, apartment 42. I understand there is a document before you that purports to give someone authority to act on my behalf in a property transaction." The notary's reading glasses had come up off their chain and onto her nose. She was looking at Daria with the undivided attention of someone who had just identified a situation requiring extreme care. "That is correct," she said. "I did not sign that document," Daria said. "I have never authorized anyone to conduct a property transaction on my behalf. If my signature appears on any document in this office, that signature is a forgery." The silence in the room was total. Bogdan was on his feet. He was saying something. She could hear his voice, the pitch of it climbing toward the register of a man who is running out of controlled options, but she had, in a way she could not quite explain, stopped hearing him as a full person and started hearing him as a sound, a particular kind of noise that she had heard too much of and was now done with. "Dasha, listen," he started. "I'm speaking to the notary," she said. She did not look at him. Tatiana Pavlovna Semyonova had the document in her hands. She was looking at the signature on it with the focused attention of a professional who has just been told to look carefully. She set it down. She looked at Bogdan. She looked at Daria. She took her reading glasses off again and set them on the desk. "Young woman," she said to Daria, with the particular courtesy of a Russian professional woman, addressing another professional woman in a situation that has just become considerably more serious than anticipated. "Are you prepared to attest to this formally, in the presence of witnesses?" "I am," Daria said, "and I have supporting documentation." She reached into her bag and produced the envelope Igor had prepared: photographs, credit agreements, the draft sale document with its 6-week-old date. "I also have legal representation." She looked at the door, as if on cue, and it was, precisely, on cue, because Igor had been waiting just outside, watching the time on his phone. The door opened, and Igor Vasiliev walked in, business card already extended. He set it on the notary's desk. "I represent Daria Petrova," he said. "We have documentary evidence of a premeditated scheme to defraud her of jointly owned marital property through the use of a forged power of attorney. We also have evidence of a prearranged agreement with a buyer that predates this transaction by 6 weeks. He placed a folder on the desk. "I'd recommend reviewing this before we discuss next steps." Bogdan's briefcase hit the floor. He did not pick it up. Elena had both hands pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were doing the mathematics of personal liability in real time. You could watch it happening, the calculation of what she had agreed to do and what that agreement now meant for her specifically. She turned to Bogdan. "You said it was clean," she said. "You said there was no way." "Stop talking," he said. His voice had gone flat and cold. "He told me it was legal," she said, now addressing the notary, now addressing Egor, now addressing anyone in the room who was not Bogdan. "He said the signature was verified. He said the notary was—" She stopped herself 1 word from the end of that sentence. which was the one word she could not afford to finish. Tatiana Pavlovna Semyonova had already reached for the telephone on her desk. "I am required to contact the relevant authorities when there is a credible allegation of document fraud in my office," she said, in the tone of a woman reading from an internal regulation she has memorized. She looked at Bogdan over the top of her glasses. "I would strongly encourage both of you to remain where you are." Bogdan turned to Daria. This was the moment, the one she had been bracing for, the one she had told herself she was ready for. He stepped toward her, and the look on his face was something she had never seen from him in 10 years. Not anger, exactly, but something beneath anger. The stripped-back face of a person whose plan has failed and who is now, for the first time, genuinely afraid. "You have no idea what you've done," he said quietly. It was meant to sound like a threat. It came out sounding like a man standing in the wreckage of something he had built very carefully, realizing he had miscalculated the foundation. She looked at him. She thought about the chulin. She thought about the storage room and the printer paper and her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought about the stethoscope her father had given her. She thought about 10 years of making his coffee and carrying his suits to the dry cleaner and lying awake in the dark beside a man who had been, for years, measuring her for a coffin she didn't know she was standing in. "I know exactly what I've done," she said. And she looked away from him, because he was no longer the most important thing in the room. In fact, he was no longer, in any meaningful sense, her problem. The police arrived 17 minutes later. Bogdan and Elena were escorted to separate rooms. The notary's office became, temporarily, a different kind of room entirely: forms, statements, official language, the particular bureaucratic machinery that cranks to life when a private betrayal becomes a matter of public record. Egor handled most of it. That was what he was there for. Daria sat in a chair by the window and drank a glass of water that Tatiana Pavlovna had poured for her without being asked. The notary sat across from her for a moment, reading glasses back on their chain, and looked at her with an expression that contained, if not quite warmth, then something close to it. "You held yourself well," she said. Daria nodded. She was looking out the window at the street below, the ordinary late-afternoon street. People coming home from work, the flower seller still at her corner, the delivery truck gone. The city, indifferent and continuous, doing what cities do. There's a thing nobody tells you about the moment after a confrontation like that. You expect to feel something large, triumph, or relief, or the catharsis of a long-building storm finally breaking. And there is some of that. But mostly what you feel is tired. Very, very tired. In the specific way of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just set it down. The absence of the weight is real, but the muscles are still shaped around where it used to be. She would feel the rest later. She had learned, over years of medicine, that the body processes things on its own schedule. For now, she had one more thing to do. She took out her phone and called the hospital. "Maria Ivanovna," she said when the department head answered, in a voice that was steady and professional and entirely her own. "I apologize for today. I had a family situation. I'll be in tomorrow morning at 5:45. A pause on the other end. And here's the thing about the general here, is the moment where the arc closes. Because the woman had been running that department with the warmth of a military tribunal for 11 straight years, she had written Daria up for a 4-minute delay once. 4 minutes. Daria still had the memo. And yet the voice that came back through the phone was not the voice of a commanding officer. It was the voice of someone who had been watching a good doctor work nights and weekends without a word of complaint for over a decade, and had apparently been paying more attention than she let on. "Are you all right, Daria Sergeyevna?" she said. "Yes," Daria said. And it was true, in the way that things can be true before they're finished. "I will be." A pause. Then, 5:45. "Do not be late." The general, returning to form. Some people show you their whole heart in one sentence and then immediately pretend it didn't happen. Daria smiled at her phone. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings moved at the pace. Legal proceedings always move, which is to say, slowly, with paperwork, and with a great deal of time spent waiting in corridors outside rooms where decisions were being made. Egor navigated all of it. Bogdan, faced with the documentary evidence and Elena's willingness to describe his role in precise detail in exchange for reduced exposure, agreed to a settlement rather than face a full criminal proceeding. The apartment was sold. Half the proceeds went to Daria. The credit lines, the ones that had been so carefully arranged in her name, were renegotiated with documentation proving the funds had been used for joint property. It was not a perfect outcome. Perfect outcomes don't exist in divorce law or in life, but it was a fair one, and fair was enough. Daria found her new apartment on a Tuesday morning, which felt appropriate. Third floor, small rooms, windows that looked out onto a courtyard with a single tree that had somehow survived being planted in the middle of an asphalt city. She signed the lease with her own name, her own money, and nobody else's permission. The day she moved in, she stood in the empty main room and listened to the silence. Good silence, the kind that belongs to you. She put her stethoscope on the windowsill. She put a small potted plant beside it. She opened the window. The spring air came in. There is a Russian concept, it doesn't have a precise English translation, called UIUT, which is something like coziness, but deeper than that. It describes the feeling of a space that is genuinely, warmly yours, a shelter that is also a home. For 10 years, Daria had tried to build UIUT inside an apartment that was, without her knowing it, being held by someone who intended to take it from her. You cannot build warmth in a place where someone is planning your eviction. She understood that now. The new apartment was smaller. It had no expensive renovation, no chosen tiles, no carefully selected bedroom wallpaper. It had a tree in the courtyard and windows that let in light and silence that was hers. It was more than enough. Her neighbor from the first floor knocked that evening. An older woman, wide and comfortable as an armchair, holding a paper bag that smelled of meat and pastry and home. "You're alone," the neighbor said, in the direct and entirely non-judgmental way of a certain generation of Russian women. "You shouldn't eat alone your first night. I made pierogi." Daria took the bag. Her eyes went warm without her permission. "Come in," she said. "I don't have furniture yet, but—" "I've sat on worse," the woman said, and came in. They sat on the floor of the empty apartment and ate pierogi in the dark because Daria hadn't found the light switch yet, which the neighbor found extremely funny, and which Daria, after a moment, found funny too. And the laugh that came out of her was surprised and genuine and a little rusty from disuse, the kind of laugh that surfaces when something in you has been waiting a long time to breathe. She was on the bus stop near the hospital 3 weeks after the settlement, waiting for the number 12, when she felt it. The particular quality of a gaze. She had felt it once before, on a cold autumn morning that felt like a different lifetime. She turned. The woman on the bench was thinner. She was wearing the same long coat, the same rose-patterned headscarf, but the coat hung differently than it had before, the way fabric hangs on a frame that has lost some of its filling. Her hands, folded in her lap, were still. Her face, when she raised it, had the same clear eyes, the same unhurried attention. But there was something in the quality of that attention that was different now, something receding, like a light that is still bright but knows it is on a dimmer. She saw Daria see her, and she smiled. Daria took a step toward her. The bus pulled up. The crowd surged forward, as crowds do, the particular blind momentum of people with somewhere to be, and in the 8 seconds it took for Daria to sidestep it and push through to the bench was empty. A small bundle of dried herbs sat on the wood where the woman had been, tied with a red thread. It smelled, when Daria picked it up, of something she couldn't name, exactly field grass, maybe, and something older, the smell of somewhere far from the city, and far from all of this. She pressed it between her palms. She stood at the empty bench for a moment. "Thank you," she said, to the empty air and the city and whatever it was that had decided, on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, that she was worth the trouble of saving. The call came 11 days later, at 9 in the evening, an unfamiliar number. A voice from the palliative care unit at the Central City Hospital, precise and professional, explaining that they had a patient without documents, very ill, who had given them Daria's name. She said you'd understand. Daria was already putting on her coat before the call ended. The ward was quiet. Late visiting hours, low lights, the particular hush of a place that handles tenderness professionally. The room was small. A single window, a single bed, a single lamp on the bedside table casting a warm circle of light over the figure in it. The woman was smaller lying down. Illness does that. But the eyes, when they opened and found Daria in the doorway, were exactly the same as they had always been, clear and present, and somehow both very old and very young at once. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." Daria sat in the chair beside the bed and took her hand. The hand was cold, the same cold as it had been that first morning, not the cold of illness, but the particular cold of someone whose body has been spending its warmth on something else for a very long time and is now running low. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daria asked. "That morning at the bus stop you were already this ill." The woman was quiet for a moment. "It needed doing," she said. "There are people you see, when you've reached a certain age, who are about to lose themselves. Not their life, their self. The quiet ones are the most at risk, the ones who have learned to make themselves small." She looked at Daria steadily. "You were making yourself very small." Daria was crying. She hadn't decided to cry. It was just happening, the way weather happens. She didn't try to stop it. "I see a few of them," the woman continued. "In a life, you get a few chances to push someone in the right direction at the right moment. It's not power, it's just timing. Knowing when the road is about to fork." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she was still smiling. "You did the rest yourself." "I know," Daria said. "I know." "That's the lesson," the woman said. She seemed pleased, the way a teacher is pleased when the student gets there without being told the answer. "The rescue was always yours. I only showed you the door." She did not speak again after that. She did not need to. Daria sat with her until the breathing changed, until it became the particular shallow pattern that she recognized from years of medicine as the body preparing for something it has accepted. She sat with her hand in hers and listened. The ward was quiet. The lamp stayed on. Outside the window, the city continued its continuous, indifferent, beautiful noise. She stayed until the end. In the morning she walked out of the hospital into the early light. The birds were doing something enthusiastic in the trees. The sky had the thin, washed quality of a day that has been recently cleaned. She reached into her coat pocket and found the bundle of dried herbs. She held it up for a moment against the light, then opened her hand and let the breeze take it a few dry seeds and leaf fragments spinning up and dispersing into the air. She watched until they were gone. Then she squared her shoulders, picked up her bag, and walked toward the bus stop. She had a shift starting at 6. Here is what I want to leave you with, before we close this story out. There are women in your life right now who are making themselves small, who have learned to take up less space, ask for less help, carry more than their share, and call it love. Women who have confused loyalty with silence and endurance with strength. They are not weak women. They are, often, the strongest people in the room, which is precisely why they are so vulnerable to the kind of person who recognizes that strength and decides to use it. I know some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you've lived it. Maybe you're living it right now. And if that's you, I want you to hear this next part directly. Watch for them. Be the stranger on the bench when you can. You don't have to know the whole story. You just have to say, "Pay attention. You deserve to know." And if you are that woman, if you are the one listening to this right now, the one who has been making herself small, who has been telling herself that what she feels isn't what it is, then hear this. The door is already there. Someone may have to show it to you, but the walking through is yours. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you know, or something you've lived through, or a door you've been standing in front of, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you're taking with you. We read every one, and it matters more than you know that you're here. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And I promise it'll be worth every minute. I'll see you in the next one.